the Jesus way,
Oh, the Jesus way
is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way,
Oh, the Jesus way
is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way is the way of peace. When he is king, all wars will cease. May his peace begin with me. Gonna beat my sword
Gonna beat my sword
into a plow.
into a plow.
Gonna beat my sword
Gonna beat my sword
into a plow.
into a plow.
Gonna beat my sword into a plow. Christ is king in my life now. May his peace begin with me. Oh, the Jesus way.
Today we're talking with Melanie Snyder, who is an editor, a writer, a columnist. She's been a CEO, she's been a chairman or chairwoman of a board, and she is on the adjunct faculty at Elizabethtown College in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. Melanie, welcome to Brethren Voices.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here.
Melanie, I understand you didn't grow up Brethren and that you've kind of discovered or learned about Brethren. Can you tell us how you joined the Brethren Church?
When my husband and our children and I moved to Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania about 5 years ago, we started attending the Elizabethtown Church of the Brethren. And the only way I can describe it is I felt like I had come home somehow. When we officially joined the Elizabethtown congregation, I called my father and I said, "We've just joined the Elizabethtown Church of the Brethren." And my father said, "Well, you know that I grew up in the Church of the Brethren, right?" And I said,
No.
"What?" I had never known that. When he was a teenager, his parents moved and started attending a different church, but my father, up until the time he was in his late teens, had grown up in the Church of the Brethren. And then I found out that, in fact, I have generations of ancestors on my father's side who were all part of the Church of the Brethren. So I was, in fact, coming home.
Well, I have to ask you, because the Brethren do this name game. So what is your maiden name?
It was also Snyder.
Oh, so there's a lot of Snyders. There's a lot of Snyders who are Brethren.
There are.
Somewhere out there.
There are.
Thank you so much. Well, tell me how you got involved in and interested in conflict resolution.
About a decade ago, when we lived in Virginia, I took training to become a mediator, a community mediator, and ended up volunteering for a community mediation center for a number of years. And when we moved to Pennsylvania about 5 years ago, I learned about a different form of mediation called victim-offender reconciliation. And what we do in it's a type of restorative justice program. And what I do with that is I work with juveniles who have committed crimes, and I work with the victims of their crimes. And if both the victim and the offender are willing, we bring them together face to face to work through how the offender needs to try to set things right with the victim. And it's a wonderful process. It empowers victims, and it gives offenders an opportunity to show that they are better than whatever crime they may have committed. So I got involved in that about 5 years ago, and that was what ultimately led me to learn more about Marie Hamilton and her work, and ended up writing a book about her work for restorative justice in the Pennsylvania prison system.
Well, for the victim to actually meet the offender is a fairly novel concept, because usually you have attorneys and the attorneys talk to each other and they don't let the actual people involved say very much.
Absolutely. The reason it works is when the local justice system allows for the opportunity of victim-offender reconciliation as an alternative to going through our typical court process. And actually later this evening, I will be sharing a couple of stories of real people, real crime situations, and how that all works. and how it contrasts with our typical criminal justice system.
So it's offered as a diversion to the normal prosecution?
Sometimes it's offered as a diversion or an alternative to incarceration. Sometimes it is done as just an additional opportunity, particularly for victims. We even have a program in Pennsylvania for victims of violent crime, where the offender is in prison and has gone to trial and been incarcerated. But in that particular situation, this kind of victim-offender dialogue is more about offering the victim an opportunity for healing and closure that the criminal justice system really does not offer them.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that it works with juveniles and with the more violent offenders?
It requires a couple of things. First of all, both the victim and the offender need to come to it voluntarily. It cannot be forced or coerced for either party. The other thing is the victim really needs to be in a place where they are ready to sit down face to face with that offender. And especially in cases of violent crime, that can be a very long journey for a victim to really get to a point where they are ready to sit down with an offender. The other thing it requires is an offender who has a genuine sense of remorse for what they have done and truly wants to be accountable in a different sort of way than the criminal justice system makes them accountable. And so what about this notion of restorative justice in much more serious crime situations? I'd like to tell you another story about a woman named Jenny who suffered a devastating loss at the hands of a man named Dave. Dave murdered Jenny's brother. And I had the privilege of interviewing Jenny for the book that I've written about Marie Hamilton and her work for restorative justice in the Pennsylvania prisons. Jenny told me that for 12 years, she had been consumed by fear, rage, all sorts of feelings against Dave that were controlling her life. It had had an effect on her health. It had an effect on her children. It had really started consuming every aspect of Jenny's daily life. And she realized she was going to have to do something to deal with this. Now, Dave, the man who had murdered her brother, had been tried and sent to prison. And that did not help Jenny. It did nothing for her to know that he was in prison. It did not address the pain that she felt. Well, Jenny found out about a restorative justice program that we offer in Pennsylvania that specifically is for victims of violent crime. And it allows those victims to request a mediation with the person who committed that violent crime against them. And so Jenny requested a mediation with Dave. And Marie Hamilton, the woman that I mentioned, was assigned as one of the mediators. Over a period of about 6 months or so, Marie Hamilton and another mediator met with Jenny on a regular basis to help her prepare for sitting down with Dave face to face, to help her figure out what kinds of things she wanted to say to Dave, what kinds of questions she wanted to ask him. And there was a lot that Jenny wanted to say. Now, Jenny's family, by the way, was furious with her that she was going to do this. They said, how can you even consider sitting down with that cold-blooded killer? And when I asked Jenny what made her decide to do this, she said, all I know is this was something I needed to do for myself, because my anger and my fear was eating me alive. Now, during the 6 months when Marie Hamilton and the other mediator were meeting with Jenny, They were also going into the prison where Dave was serving his sentence, and they were meeting with him on a regular basis to help him prepare to sit down face to face with Jenny. Dave was actually terrified at the prospect of having to face Jenny. He was terrified at having to see her rage, her pain, and to know that he was the one who had caused all of that damage. But Dave also desperately wanted a chance for redemption. So after these many long months of preparation with Dave and with Jenny separately, Marie Hamilton and the other mediator brought them together in the prison where Dave was serving his sentence. Their mediation took nearly 8 hours. Jenny had the opportunity to ask questions that had been weighing on her for 12 long years. She was able to express to Dave her rage, her confusion, her fears. Questions like, why? Why did you kill my brother? Dave had a lot of things that he wanted to say to Jenny, too. Things that had been weighing on him for 12 years in his prison cell. They shared their stories. They cried together. And believe it or not, toward the end of that long day, they even laughed together, sharing some stories of their mutual memories of Jenny's brother. Toward the end of their time together, this is what Dave said to Jenny. He told her, "I know that there is nothing I can say that will ever be enough to make up for what I did. And I know that saying I'm sorry doesn't even begin to take away the fact that your brother is dead. I have had to live with that fact every day for the past 12 years, and it's haunted me every night. How I could have been so messed up to do what I did. I don't expect you to ever forgive me, but I do want you to know how deeply sorry I am." And after 12 long years of pain, rage, 6 months of preparation for this moment, and 8 hours of mediation, Jenny had one more thing she wanted to say to Dave, and she finally felt ready. "I forgive you, Dave. I will never forget what you did to me and my family. But I forgive you. I'm hoping to move on with my life now. And I hope you can move on with your life too." Through restorative justice, Jenny was able to do something that the criminal justice system had never helped her to do. And though she would always remember what Dave had done, forgiving Dave was what Jenny needed to secure her own freedom. It's like what the theologian Lewis B. Smedes once said, "To forgive is to set a prisoner free and discover that the prisoner was you." And as for Dave, he remained in prison after that mediation with Jenny. He served out the rest of his sentence. But being given that opportunity to express his deep remorse to Jenny and receiving her forgiveness helped to restore Dave's humanity. Marie Hamilton, through her 30 years of work in the prisons, saw that restorative justice could provide that kind of healing, that kind of humanity, even in the face of truly horrific crime. Now, I want to be clear. Restorative justice is not a panacea. It's not a magic pill or a simple solution to address every crime, to turn every offender's life around. There's no question that there are dangerous, violent criminals who lack remorse for their actions, who are not willing to be accountable. And yet, at the same time, our prisons in America house tens of thousands of people who do want that kind of opportunity for redemption, who do feel incredible remorse for what they have done. And yet, if we think about it, restorative justice doesn't fit with our tough on crime attitudes in this country. It doesn't seem to work the way that we want it to work in terms of punishment. A report that was published a little over a year ago by the Pew Charitable Trust revealed that 1 out of every 100 American adults is currently incarcerated. 1 out of 100. That is a higher incarceration rate than any other country in the world. And the U.S. Department of Justice has released statistics that shows that as many as 2/3 of the people who are in our jails in this country are petty, non-violent offenders who haven't even come to trial yet. And many of them will sit behind bars for as long as a year, waiting for their cases to even be heard in court. All of this incarceration that we have going on, incarceration of petty, nonviolent offenders in particular, will cost American taxpayers $9 billion this year alone to house people who haven't even been officially convicted of anything yet. But there are proven effective alternatives to all of this incarceration, and restorative justice is one of those alternatives. A restorative approach to crime is possible far more often than we might think, and certainly far more often than we currently use it in the United States. And research has actually shown that offenders who go through a restorative justice process are significantly less likely to ever commit another crime. United States Senator Jim Webb recently observed, quote, "We have an incarceration rate in the United States, the world's greatest democracy, that is 5 times as high as the incarceration rate of the whole rest of the world." And he said there are only 2 possibilities here. Either we have the most evil people on earth living in the United States, or we are doing something dramatically wrong. Again, there are no simple solutions to fix what is dramatically wrong with all of the incarceration we are doing in the United States. But I believe that restorative justice can start giving us ideas for a different way. Marie Hamilton, through her lifelong work and advocacy for restorative justice, has inspired me to really take a hard look at what we are doing and to consider another way. And I hope that her example might inspire you to do the same.
I also understand that you teach these concepts and you teach this kind of a program to other people. Do you teach it in places where they haven't done it before and they'd like to start a program?
Well, I teach conflict resolution workshops like what I've done here today. With regard to the restorative justice and victim offender mediation, I don't teach that. I am a practitioner of that. I'm a mediator myself.
Okay.
The other teaching that I do is at Elizabethtown College, and there I teach undergraduate writing courses.
Oh,
So
really?
it's on a different, sort of down a different road.
Let's talk about the restorative justice.
Right.
Because you have written a book, and
Right.
the book is Grace Goes to Prison. And the book is about a Brethren woman who was a volunteer in a prison.
Yes.
And just tell us a little bit about, but her name really
Right.
wasn't, her name was not Grace.
Well, it was. That's a beautiful part of the story. Her name is Grace Marie Hamilton.
Oh.
She's a lifelong member of the Church of the Brethren, and she started volunteering in Pennsylvania state prisons back in the mid-1970s. And over the years, she learned about restorative justice and became a real advocate for restorative justice and alternatives to incarceration. The story behind her name, she goes by Marie to this day. She went by the name Marie her whole life, which is her middle name. And as I started working with her and doing the research for her book, I discovered that her real first name was Grace. And I said, well, why do you go by your middle name? And she told me, I've never felt worthy of the name Grace,
Ooh.
so I don't use it. But as I went into the prisons and interviewed many of the incarcerated men and women that she had worked with over the 30 years of her prison volunteering, the stories they told me seemed really to be the epitome of grace. And one inmate named Jerry told me this story. Jerry has known Marie Hamilton for pretty much all of the 24 years that he has been incarcerated. And I was just asking him about prison life. And I said, after 24 years of being in prison, how do you keep getting up in the morning and dealing with this, interminable prison sentence? And Jerry told me, well, there are two definitions that I try to keep in mind that help keep me going. He said, mercy is when God doesn't give you what you really deserve to get. And grace is when God gives you what you do not deserve. And I thought that was beautiful. And then he said, by the way, we didn't deserve Marie Hamilton here in the prisons, but we felt like God sent her to us anyway. And I said, Jerry, do you know what Marie Hamilton's real first name is? And he said, no, what is it? And I said, it's Grace. And he said, I think that needs to be the title of the book. Mm-hmm. So that's how we came up with Grace Goes to Prison.
It's a wonderful title, and I think restorative justice is probably at the heart of what the Church of the Brethren stands for.
I believe so. And the interesting thing about restorative justice is that it's really based on ancient principles that I think in our current tough on crime mentality with regard to our criminal justice system, we've sort of moved away from the wisdom that's behind restorative justice. But it's really about broken relationships and offering healing and redemption and reconciliation for people whose relationships have been torn apart by crime.
Isn't it Galatians that talks about do justice? And I think it's Galatians.
Do justice and love mercy.
Yeah.
It's Micah. Yes.
Well, it's Micah.
Yes.
Well, there you go. Melanie, we're going to come back and talk with you again, but first let's have a message from Brother and Volunteer Services.
This is a world full of options. It's like a never-ending buffet line. While all that I'm really needing is living water and the bread of life. So as I'm walking through this life, making choices, there is one thing I must never forget. This land of opportunity.
What I'm very curious about is making the victim whole part of restorative justice to the extent that that can be done?
Absolutely. Many of the victims we work with in restorative justice tell us that the criminal justice system process really doesn't offer them the kind of healing and closure that they need. Quite often, victims have a lot of questions that they want to ask directly of the offender. And the criminal justice system, as you mentioned earlier, tends to keep victims and offenders apart. The lawyers don't want them talking to each other or having anything to do with one another, really. And so restorative justice really offers a form of empowerment to victims that they don't have in the criminal justice system. Because if you think about it, in the criminal justice system, the state takes over as the de facto victim, and victims really are largely cut out of the process in the criminal justice system unless they're needed to testify or, serve as witnesses and that sort of thing.
Melanie, thank you so much for sharing with us on Brethren Voices. And thank you for coming to Portland, and thank you for working with the Brethren Volunteers.
Thank you. It's been an honor to be here, and I've really enjoyed our interview.
And thank you very much for watching Brethren Voices. This is Brent Carlson. Peace.
Those who tread the path he trod shall be called the friends of God. May his peace begin with me. Oh, the Jesus way
Oh, the Jesus way
is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way
Oh, the Jesus way
is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way is the way of peace. When he is king, all wars will cease. May his peace begin with me.